Module 5. I call this module the Age of Revolution because that's the big theme, revolution, political revolution, the main theme, and then we'll see following the revolutions there'll be an economic revolution as well. It starts in the Netherlands and Great Britain. But this module, our theme is, of course, the French Revolution and the mother of all revolutions, you might say, the French Revolution. And you have that question at the beginning of your chapter in your textbook on this about how revolutionary was the French Revolution. Well, in some respects, the way it begins, it's not all that revolutionary. And when I teach the French Revolution, I like to divide it into three sections. The first section is what I call the constitutional or liberal stage of the revolution. Constitutional/liberal stage of the revolution. That really lasts from about 1789, when the king calls the Estates General into session to try and deal with the multiple crises facing the nation, to about 1792. And then I break the revolution up into the second stage of the revolution, which is the radical stage, sometimes referred to as the terror stage, the time of Robespierre. And then the third, and that lasts from about the end of 1792 to 1794. And then I describe the final 4 to 5 years of the revolution. I set this at between 1794 and 1799. This is the conservative stage of the revolution. And a new government, you had a new government called the Directory, which is a more conservative government, still revolutionary, still a republic, meaning they didn't have a king, but much more conservative than anything that had come before it during the revolution. Finally, that government that wasn't popular with much of anyone fell in 1799 to a coup d'etat by Napoleon Bonaparte, who kind of ends the revolution. Or depending on your take on Napoleon, as he tried to say, Napoleon, he said that he was actually embracing those values of the revolution. And those values were summed up during the revolution by that phrase that you all should know: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now let's go back for a minute now. I've described the three stages of the French Revolution, but let's go back to that original question that I asked. How radical was the French Revolution? What made it stand out? And you'd have to answer, as I already alluded to at the beginning, that it wasn't all that different from what had come before it about 10 or 15 years earlier, the American Revolution. The American Revolution set out a lot of these Enlightenment principles. What changes the French Revolution is what happens in the fall of 1792 when it goes into a more radical stage. And from that point on, the French Revolution really takes on a character of its own. And more to say about that in a few minutes. But let's go back even further for a moment and think about the causes of the French Revolution. Okay, so the first cause, though you might not have realized it, I've already gone over or mentioned, and that is the American Revolution. The American Revolution made it possible. The American Revolution is also what helped to set off prequels to the French Revolution itself, unrest and rebellions in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and in Austria. And all places by this point had been impacted and affected by the Enlightenment ideas, those ideas of John Locke, and particularly as well middle-class people, or you might say business people too, were increasingly wanting their interests represented somehow in governance. Of course, you have John Locke and his influence here. You can remember that conflict that people began to talk about between a government that is run as a monarchy versus a republic, where you have a constitution that defines the relationship between the government and the governed. Constitutions transform people from subjects of the king into citizens with rights. And we saw all that in John Locke, and then we saw it put into motion, you might say, ideas put into revolutionary motion in 1776 with Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Now you can see the footprints of both John Locke and Thomas Jefferson in the French Revolution in 1789 with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It's very similar to the Declaration of Independence. Enlightenment ideas are very important. You can't have a revolution without ideas that will include how you replace the system that you're seeking to overthrow, right? You have to have ideas. Otherwise, it's just a rebellion. Okay, so other places were facing unrest in the 1780s as well, besides just France. I listed a couple of those. Be aware of those. The Netherlands. Remember, they already had a constitutional monarchy, but they want to establish, most of these places want to establish something more along the lines of what the young United States has done with its constitution. By 1789, the U.S. has a constitution and becomes itself a republic. But this is a class about mostly about European history. Let's go over and see how things happen in France in this liberal stage of the revolution. The king at the time is a guy by the name of Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. This is a time when you realize in history as well, and not just today, that public image is very important. And the printing presses around Paris had been churning out, you can read about these in your textbook, these pamphlets criticizing the king in the most blatant of ways, in often the most vulgar of ways. Marie Antoinette is particularly drugged through the gutter, you might say, of the press, and all these salacious stories published about her, often including stories of her sexual promiscuity. Right? There's not a little bit, quite the opposite. There's a lot of sexism here going on. The king isn't treated nearly as bad, really, in most of these pamphlets as Queen Marie Antoinette. Her famous quote there, "Let them eat cake." So you had all this going on in the press. Then you had the emergency in the countryside about the financial situation. That's another cause for the French Revolution. Now we have a number of factors beginning to add up. We have the example of the American Revolution. We have Enlightenment ideas. We have other governments in Europe trying to implement reforms. The French try to implement reforms. Then Louis calls into session the States General because he's facing a fiscal crisis. That's a financial crisis. He's paying all of his money more and more on debt on interest for the national debt, money that he'd borrowed from loans, and his actual idea was his financial minister Louis XVI was to raise the land tax. This causes aristocrats and nobles, the upper class people in France, to threaten revolt against the king. So his first threat actually isn't necessarily to unrest by the masses of people and the lower class people, but it's actually even by his upper class. And then you'll read, though, that the revolution does spread to the lower classes with the storming of the Bastille and the tricolor flag of revolution being hoisted over what was the National Assembly in France, which was the revolutionary body that charged itself for writing a new constitution for France. This is the liberal stage of the revolution. They draw up a constitution following the storming of the Bastille by the people of France. That was a big thing, right? Because the Bastille was the symbol of French monarchy, of Louis XVI's power and authority over France. So keep that in mind, as French still celebrate this as we Americans might celebrate the 4th of July. Patriotism combined with this sense of revolutionary values. The tricolor flag of France doesn't stand for the king anymore. It stands for the values and for liberation, for liberty, equality, and fraternity. Those three slogans of the French Revolution. So France creates a constitutional monarchy then under this National Assembly. The very way that the people assembled in the National Assembly on the left room and the right side of the room would become political shorthand that we still use today for describing, in American politics, I suppose, we'd say more liberal on the left side and more conservative on the right. It had originally to do with just the way people were sitting in the room at the time, and they were sitting amongst their friends and the friends who they shared their ideology with, their political ideology. So people who wanted to see, the king's power being taken away and the establishment of a republic, those more radical people happen to be sitting on the left. You can also read about the Girondins in the mountains. That's a similar political split as well. That happened to be a little bit different when the people called the Mountains were sitting up in the high seats. But the point is the same, that people were incredibly politicized at this time, and becoming more politicized and more politically aware are these new groups coming into politics, including one that I'd like to point out as well, called the sans-culottes. Sans-culottes. Culottes, it kind of looks like in English. It literally means, don't laugh, without trousers, but that actually referred to working class people's clothes. They didn't, many of you probably know that kind of 18th century look of the powdered wigs and things like that, but they also wore those short breeches, those short pants, knee breeches. Working class people didn't wear those knee breeches. They wore more often tunics, things, different kind of clothes, tunics, which kind of a robe-like thing, right? They couldn't afford those clothes. They couldn't afford the powdered wigs and things like that either. But they become, and that's what the name means, sans-culotte. They become very proud of the fact that they don't have those aristocratic knee breeches. They kind of wear their working class credentials, or some of them aren't really working class, but kind of we might call lower middle class shopkeepers. I often say the bread bakers and the candlestick makers, right? People working in small workshops, people who largely had been illiterate as well. These people had become very politically active at this time, especially in the city of Paris. And what happens to move us out of this conservative, out of this liberal or constitutional stage of the revolution, is war. Is the fact that by the fall of 1792, France is declaring war on most of its neighbors, and most of its neighbors are also trying to invade France. This gives an opportunity for the left to seize control. Think of it in this way, and when I say the left, I mean people that were represented by the sans-culottes, the kind of more lower class people, not all lower class people, but the sans-culottes was one of those important groups, but also by Robespierre and these groups that were known as Jacobins. They want to establish a straight-up republic. They don't want to. The Constitution that had first been passed created a constitutional monarchy. The Louis the XVI, I always tell my students, still had a job. But Louis's mistake, you might argue, is that once he sees and he helps to declare war on all of France's neighbors, he also then tries to escape outside of France so he can join up with the armies that are invading France. He sees his savior, his salvation, in these foreign countries, and the kings in those countries, like Prussia and Austria, who want to overthrow the French Revolution, who want to send and restore the monarchy, and get rid of even probably the National Assembly. This radicalizes a lot of the supporters of the revolution in France. And soldiers begin marching into Paris rather, from the countryside, being reorganized into these brigades, these revolutionary brigades, singing this new song called the Marseillaise, which is still the French national anthem today, flying the tricolor revolutionary flag, singing songs, liberty, equality, and fraternity. And they actually are able to turn back those invading armies of the foreign invaders of France, but then they also begin going on the march across Europe as well, spreading the French Revolution wherever they go, and announcing to the peasants everywhere they go that they are now free. One thing that the French Revolution does, even in the constitutional stage, is it abolishes slavery. Now, in the radical stage, Robespierre tries to do a lot more. He tries to remake all of society. This is what I call the radical stage of the French Revolution. This is when you have this contradiction in your text. The textbook talks about this contradiction between Robespierre and the Jacobins wanting to institute a new kind of era of freedom and democracy, but they also are doing a lot of this at the point of a gun and with the threat of violence. And enter onto the revolutionary scene here, the guillotine, and these kind of political efforts to root out any sedition or treason or anything against the revolution and the republic. The king is captured around this time. He's going to be imprisoned along with his wife, Marie Antoinette. They will be put on trial and accused of treason. A debate ensues on what they should do with the king. Some want to simply, hold him and thought he was guilty of committing treason by running over to the other side and trying to escape France to join up with invading armies. Others want to put him to death. And that's eventually what happens to him and his wife, is that they are guillotined themselves. Well, committees of what were called committees of public safety are set up across the country in France. People are brought up on trial in front of these tribunals where they would have to defend themselves. No one, by the end of this, after about a year and a half, 2 years of this, no one is feeling safe anymore because it kind of careens out of control. There's a real sense of insecurity that at any moment your neighbor or even your friend might, in order to defend themselves, might accuse you of being an enemy of the revolution, and you might end up being guillotined yourself. So this is a kind of instability. It's kind of a snake that begins to eat its own tail, a metaphor that's often used to describe this kind of politics, because in the end it's a very self-defeating, because you're sowing so much uncertainty into the system. So the Committee of Public Safety eventually will turn on Robespierre himself. He'll be brought up on trial. He'll be executed. Only unlike his most victims of the guillotine, where you're face down, he'll be put face up. Okay, so that brings it in then really to the radical stage of the French Revolution. And then there's a pushback. There was a terror largely that targeted more conservative people in society. This was known as the Red Terror. Even back then, the color red begins to be associated more and more with people on the left of politics, or even on what we might call today the far left. And then there was another terror after conservatives gained control in France again and formed this new government called the Directory. They also carry out a lot of tribunals again too, and against this time the radicals and the Jacobins. Once they aren't in power, they're also going to be brought before tribunals as well in what's known as the White Terror. White refers to more conservative forces. And then you have this revolutionary army that begins fanning out across Europe and even across the French Empire, bringing these revolutionary ideas with them. And in Haiti, in the French, as it was called at the time, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, this is going to spark a revolution. First by free people of color, as they were known on the island of Haiti. These were people of African descent or of partial African descent who were not enslaved on this island where most of the economy revolved about in slavery. These folks were about 5% of the population. They simply wanted, the free people of color simply wanted to adopt a similar constitutional government and have a liberal constitution that would guarantee them property rights and racial equality with their white plantation owner brothers, you might say. But you know what happens there? The whites in Haiti reject that, and then some of those free people of color say, you know, I bet we know somebody who will support us. And around this time is when enslaved persons begin revolting on the plantations. And Haiti will experience a full-fledged revolution and the establishment eventually of the first Black Republic. You can read about Louverture, the Black general there in Haiti, who leads his troops against all these foreign powers that try to overthrow the Haitian Revolution. Ultimately, unsuccessfully, a Black Republic is formed in Haiti, although there will be lots of challenges for that Black Republic in the future. Okay, so I've gone through with you today now a kind of a quick narrative, a quick story of the French Revolution. I talked about the various causes of it. I said why it was different than the other revolutions and how revolutionary it was. And then we talked about a little bit about how it began to end. Let's continue this discussion now online and on the discussion board. I will see you all then. Thank you so much for listening.
Stop taking video button.